When we think about media and its impact, we often focus on what kids are consuming the shows, the games, the movies. But what about how we talk with kids about what they're seeing? In this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Maura Snyder, a researcher whose work explores exactly that the ways parents can mediate, guide, and make meaning of media alongside their children. From preschoolers and animated characters to post pandemic parenting in the Barbie movie, Dr. Snyder's research sheds light on how parents shape their children's understanding of the world through everyday conversations about media. Together, we talk about what parental mediation really is, why it matters, and what makes it so powerful, not just for limiting media's negative effects, but for deepening connection and communication within families. Dr. Maura Snyder is an assistant professor of communication at Canisius University in Buffalo, New York. Dr. Snyder earned her PhD in communication science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she focused her research on audience interactions with media. A native of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Dr. Snyder was inspired by the long-lasting legacy of Mr. Rogers and began her research career examining preschoolers' preferences for information sources. During the pandemic, she shifted focus to parental interactions surrounding media. Dr. Snyder teaches a variety of classes that span the range of media effects while maintaining an active research agenda. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Snyder. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing well. I'm in Buffalo, but right now we're just like on the end of summer, beginning of fall weather, so there is no snow, which is the
That's nice.
ideal
Yeah,
situation
you
for
guys
us.
get hit. You guys get
Yeah,
hit really hard in
yeah,
Buffalo,
yeah. We do, but
but
yeah,
I'm sure
thank you for having me.
hopefully you at least like the snow.
Coming from Pittsburgh to Wisconsin to Buffalo, I've never known anything different. So
There.
it's
So
fine.
yeah, so
We
you
make
have
do.
you're used to it a bit. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, I love your research and I'm super excited to be with you today to talk a little bit more about it. And to kind of get us started, can you tell us a little bit about how you first became interested in studying kids, media, and parental mediation?
Yeah, definitely. So when I was an undergrad, I went to St. Vincent College. It's a small liberal arts college, kind of similar in structure to Canisius, but it's in Latrobe, Pennsylvania, which is the hometown of Mr. Rogers. And St. Vincent has a research center called the Fred Rogers Institute. And I was a very precocious freshman. And I remember it was like the first, second day of class, and I was enrolled in a child development psych class. I was a psychology undergraduate. And I went to my professor, Dr. Junlei Lee's office hours to ask like a silly question. I don't even remember what it was. But I kind of built that connection, and he was doing research in the Fred Rogers Center. And like growing up in Pittsburgh, you hear Mr. Rogers everywhere. Like it's ingrained in our blood of Pittsburgh. And I just kind of got involved with researching with him. And his research wasn't quite on children's media, it was more on caregiver child interactions. But the Fred Rogers Center at large was about children's media. I entered St. Vincent with a scholarship called the Fred Rogers Scholarship. And, through there, I was just like in the Fred Rogers, it was called the Fred Rogers Center when I was in undergrad, now it's the Institute. But I just kind of got very interested in how kids are thinking about media and how we can use media for good. And then when it came time to apply for grad school, I applied to both psych programs and communication programs and ended up at UW-Madison. I knew I wanted to do something with children's media. And that's kind of the quick-ish Cliff Notes version of how I got started.
No, that is totally awesome. And I forget about the Fred Rogers connection in Pittsburgh, but that is like really cool and super unique in terms of like
Yeah,
research and academic background. I think
yeah.
that is unique and creative.
Yeah, and like when I entered grad school, so part of being a Fred Rogers Scholar was we had a bunch of different speakers on campus through the Fred Rogers Center. We had Dr. Alice Wilder, who is the creator of Blue's Clues, alongside Angela Santamero, who's the creator of Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood. But she was on campus, and after I met her, I think it was my sophomore year, I was like, that's my job. I'm going to create kids programs. And I became very fixated on that. Um, But then once I went to grad school, I kind of realized, well, it's not just the media that matters. And I have this very distinct memory of Dr. Lee telling me, you know, don't get too caught up on the media. Like, think about what Fred would say, because we always called him Fred. And we were like, he was like, Fred would say it's not the media that matters, it's the interactions with the media that matters. And I was like, I'm 21, 22 years old. You don't know anything. I'm going to create meaningful media. And there's something to say about creating meaningful media, but it is funny when I look back now and I'm like, darn it, he was actually right. And I did just kind of naturally pivot into the meaningful media conversations between parents and their children.
Well, that is fascinating. And that's a really good segue to my next question, actually. But you started your work looking at preschoolers and then shifted to parents during the pandemic. What led to that pivot?
Well, so practically, I defended my prospectus or not my prospectus, my preliminary exams in August of 2020. And we did not have vaccines. We did not have, they were developing the vaccines. We did not know when they would be available. And once I defended my preliminary exams, I had to start on my prospectus. And I was thinking, and I was like, well, with all of these unknowns, I could say I'm going to research with preschoolers, but I don't know if that's going to stunt my progress in getting my dissertation done because I don't know if I'm going to be able to go into preschools. I don't really know what that's going to look like. How would kids are already kind of weird with researchers. How is it going to be with both of us are wearing masks? Is it safe to do it? And then I kind of realized that a huge part of the media itself is this interaction with the parents. And, research has shown really consistently since like the 1980s that parental mediation is the most effective way to stop negative effects and increase positive effects. But there's this issue that parents are busy and they are not, it's hard to find time to have these conversations with kids about their media use. And so I decided, you know what, let's just practically pivot, but also in a way that keeps my research applicable to the general public and what's actually happening in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes perfect sense. And for listeners who might not know the term, excuse me, what exactly is parental mediation?
Yeah, great question. Parental mediation is any conversation or restriction parents place on their child's media use. So there's three different types. Active mediation, which is really just having a conversation. Doesn't matter, there's positive active, so commenting on the good things in the media, or negative active, commenting on the bad things the parents see. There's restrictive mediation, which is like placing time limits on phone use, tablet use, anything like that. And then there's just simply co-viewing, which is watching TV with your child. Co-viewing counts as mediation because it's still like you're sharing the media space with your kid, but it's the least effective in terms of like helping amplify positive effects or mitigate negative effects. But really, too long didn't read. Parental mediation is having any sort of interaction between a parent or a caregiver, an adult, with the child.
Beautifully explained. That's awesome. And why is it so important for parents to actively mediate media content with their kids?
Yeah, I mean, kids are just seeing so much stuff out there, and especially with the little ones. I mean, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends no screen time before 2. That's just really not practical. There's so much going on. Sometimes you need to turn on Bluey for your child and to watch it and let everyone decompress. Um, but also when we think about like preschoolers, 3 to 5 year olds, there's this problem that, children's media researchers have deemed the transfer problem, which is really that kids are really, really great at understanding a lesson in the context of the media that they're watching, in the context of the story that they're watching. But it's really hard for them to apply that to everyday life. So the example that I give and that restarted my research with preschoolers was you have Mr. Rogers, who's like a real human. He's talking to real kids. Yeah, he has his puppets, but it's very clear that that's like the make-believe. It's the land of make-believe. But then you go to Daniel Tiger's neighborhood and you have a tiger who's interacting with a cat who also has an owl friend, but then has a prince human friend. And they're just kind of all interacting together. And a lot of the storylines involve like bringing people together, not feeling these differences between different kids or different species and all of these different elements. But kids really, like, when you ask a kid, well, what was that lesson of Daniel Tiger about? They can explain it in terms of like Daniel Tiger was afraid to go to the doctor, but they struggle to transfer that to their daily lives, to take that step of, oh, Daniel Tiger was afraid to go to the doctor. I'm afraid to go to the doctor, or my sister is. And so when parents sit down with their kids and they're able to say, hey, Daniel was afraid to go to the doctor. Do you ever feel that way? Just like a simple question like that can help the kid kind of make that connection in their mind that it's just, they haven't developed those skills yet.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, and that's a very simple example, but also obviously, if you don't want your kids seeing negative things in the media or even just like different bodies, only seeing one body type in the media and being able to say, hey, like that person doesn't actually look like me, or like Barbie looks very different than how mommy looks, it helps the kid kind of point out those differences or those kind of inconsistencies in the media world to their world. And it can just help them apply the lessons to their day-to-day lives.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes total sense. And kind of piggybacking off of that, what are some common misconceptions people have about how kids are influenced by the media or
Yeah,
by
I
media?
mean, yeah, it's a great question. I mean, in my media literacy class yesterday, we were talking about like how after every single mass shooting, unfortunately, it's like, oh, they played video games when they were a kid. They did all of these things. And yes, the media is impactful. Like the media is going to bring up some maybe not so great attitudes or beliefs. It can really develop stereotypes towards different groups. But at the same time, like media can be really helpful, but it isn't a one size fits all application to media effects. And I think that's something that the communication about how kids, no matter what age, but how they're affected by media, the conversation's usually like, your kid watches Disney princess movies, guess what? They're gonna become a helpless damsel in distress versus just, it being a fairy tale, it being a time to relax. Um, but I think that's the biggest thing is people kind of unfortunately like to fear monger when it comes to media use.
Hmm.
And also, a lot of the conversations around children's media use is on the negative things that happen. Um, they're focused on potential violent effects, they're focused on increased aggression or, having a worse sense of body image. But that's not the full story. The full story is that media is a tool, and when we use it as an effective tool, it can help kids learn positive skills as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of about the quality of what they're consuming in
Yeah.
terms of their developing brains.
Yeah, exactly. And so we always want to say you think about the child, you think about the content, and you think about the context. So those are the three C's of children's media use. You need to understand your own child's developmental state. You need to understand the actual content that they're watching. Obviously, we do not want a 3-year-old watching NCIS. That's
Obviously.
something that we know is going to be harmful to them or scare them. But then you also have to think about the context. If you are consistently, if a parent is consistently using the TV as quote unquote a babysitter, no judgment, it happens. But if there's never an adult in the room with the child to discuss those things, they're really not going to reap the benefits of media use because kids are taking in so much information all the time. And I know you probably experienced it with your kids. They just like, they cannot like actually process everything that's coming towards them. And when they sit down and just observe media very passively, they become kind of, I don't want to say like sponges, but they can be like a little sponge. But it's a very particular kind of sponge because they're learning from the media itself, but like it's really hard to actually take that lesson and apply it without an adult intervening.
Yeah, absolutely. So your dissertation looked at post-COVID trends in parental mediation. What stood out to you most about how parents are or aren't engaging with their children's media
Yeah.
use today?
It wasn't necessarily surprising that parents did were not mediating their child's content a lot. Um, but really, it was like a very mid level of parents reporting mediation. And, notably, I surveyed 350 parents. Obviously, there's many, many more parents in the country, but most of them were just kind of saying, like, I sometimes mediate. And that could be most likely an over reporting of their actual habits. But really, what we found was like the parents who were concerned about negative effects, who thought that mediation was helpful, so like having the high response efficacy, and then that they felt that they were actually able to mediate, like they had the skills to mediate, they were the ones that were reporting more mediation habits, which isn't surprising. That's no one's going to do something that they don't think is effective. You're not going to put on sunscreen if you don't think sunscreen's going to stop you from getting burned.
Right.
And so if parents, yeah, and like it's also like parents, they just have so much happening. And like I don't have kids, but in the times that I'm like with my friends with kids or I'm babysitting, I'm like at the end of the day, I'm like I'm done, and there's a lot happening.
Yeah.
And also, I think it's really important to note that this trend probably started a little bit before COVID, but media use over the last 15, 20 years has shifted from like an actual family time of using media to very private media use. So if I think back to my childhood, I think we had two TVs in the house, but we were watching TV in the living room. Usually, at least one of my sisters was in the room. If it was after dinner, my parents were in the room too. We were watching something together. I don't really remember like conversations about the media. Maybe they happened, maybe they didn't. But the point is it was like a bonding experience for the family. And then once phones became normalized, once iPads were created and it became normalized, or Kindles, the media use just became so private and insular to the individual user. So like, I whenever I like see kids, they all kind of have their own iPad or their own Kindle and they're just kind of watching by themselves or playing a game by themselves. So those natural conversations that would occur when you're sitting in a living room with 4 or 5 other people, you can ask questions, you can comment on things that you naturally do when you're watching a movie with friends. It doesn't happen as organically. So it's not surprising that parents are not reporting a lot of mediation. Um, and that raises challenges. It raises challenges because, like, no kid is going to be happy if their parent is standing looking over their shoulder while they're playing the Switch. Like,
Yeah.
they're going to get kind of mad. And so you have to be so intentional with parental mediation nowadays. And again, it's just something that parents, like, you're trying to keep your little human alive. You're not necessarily thinking about commenting on what commercials they saw that day.
Right. Yeah. It's so interesting to think about how media has changed, like with the like invention, like you said, and the creation of all
Yeah,
of these different devices that we just didn't have probably while we were growing up. Like now
yeah,
everybody can have their own device, and we no longer need to fight about what to watch because we have these separate devices that we can watch whatever we want on.
yeah, yeah.
So
And like,
we're not even engaging in those conversations of like compromise
no,
and trying to figure out
yeah,
what we're gonna watch together.
yeah, that's like a huge element too. I mean, my one of my friends, he's an English professor here. He has a 9-year old and an 11-year old, and I was just over their house like a couple weeks ago, and they were watching Bluey, which I'm like, great, that is a good
Yeah.
research backed show. Watch Bluey all you want, but then the one was like, I'm over this. because he was like, I'm 11, I don't want to watch Bluey anymore. But he was like, I'm just going to take the iPad and watch something else. And I was like, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to stop you. I'm over watching the same episode of Bluey as well, you know? Yeah, those like, when you think about the social skills too that come about, like you said, compromise,
Right.
reaching, just having a conversation, hearing different points of view about an issue. It's just different. And it doesn't mean that it was better when we were kids. It doesn't mean that it was, worse. It's just a different environment.
Well, it's totally a different environment and a different landscape because in addition to compromise, like the tolerance for situations or like patience. I don't know if that takes place as much because now we have like we don't have to necessarily, I mean for some families, we don't have to necessarily sit at a dinner table and wait for everyone to finish eating before we go
Yeah.
do what we want. Like I'm just gonna bring my tablet to the dinner table or we're gonna go out
Yeah.
to eat, I'm gonna bring my tablet or I have my
Yeah.
phone. Or it's like so
Yeah.
like those situations that not everybody loves, but we like a lot of people learn to tolerate them and like work through
Yeah.
them. We have these
Right.
devices now that kind of like aid that process.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's really interesting. Like, my mom, every time we go to a restaurant, she's like, look at that family with their phone, like their kids using the phone. I'm like, yeah, but at the same time, like, think about like if it's your first time all week just being able to sit down with like your partner and you're out at a restaurant and your kid is acting out and you are just like at your wits end. Yeah, and again, it's a tool. Like it can be used as a self-regulation tool. We just want to make sure that we are not always relying on those tools. We want to make sure kids are developing their own self-regulation skills, that they're still meeting their needs individually before immediately turning to a device that can regulate them, like regulate for them, essentially.
Right. Right. Yeah, learning those skills. I hear you for sure.
Yeah.
So in your you applied the extended parallel process model or EPPM in your intervention. Can you explain what that is for people who are listening or watching this and what you learned from trying to apply it to parental mediation?
Yeah. So a lot of the previous research that had been done on parental mediation was simply about like what parents' concerns of media use are. And like not surprisingly, parents are scared of media. Like or they have these concerns that media might be harming my child or it might just not be helping my child enough. Like we were just saying, like whether it be displacing other activities, displacing other developmental milestones. So the extended parallel process model is a persuasion model that essentially says, based upon the severity of an issue and your susceptibility to an issue, you're gonna react differently. So, like, if you think you are susceptible to an issue and you think the issue is severe, that means that, like, your little like light bulb or like red flag is going off in your head. You're like, this is something that's going to happen. So the way that I like to think about it is like I used the sunscreen example earlier. So if I have a family history of skin cancer, I'm probably a bit more susceptible to being diagnosed with skin cancer. And then if I've had a family history of skin cancer that was difficult to treat, I may think of skin cancer as being pretty severe. So I have this threat. And there's different levels that can happen. Obviously, you can be susceptible and think it's not severe. We don't need to get into that. But you have this threat. And then based upon this threat, if it is a high enough level that you feel fear, you are then likely to be motivated to change your behavior. Changing your behavior then relies upon if you think you are able to do the intervention. So your self-efficacy of applying said intervention. And it's also based on the response efficacy of the intervention. So do you think the intervention is useful? So if we take the skin cancer sunscreen example. So we think we're gonna get skin cancer. We think skin cancer is a big threat. I think it's pretty easy for me to apply a facial moisturizer with sunscreen in the morning. And I also think that sunscreen is an effective intervention. That, like, I've seen the research, I know sunscreen prevents sun damage. I'm probably going to adapt or adopt the behavior change of applying sunscreen. So obviously there's a bunch of different components and everything's moving differently. And so when I was thinking about, parental mediation, parents tend to be afraid of negative media effects. It's something that
Hmm.
like they see in the media all the time. They hear things. And when I was in grad school in Wisconsin, it wasn't in Madison, but the Slender Man stabbings had happened a few years before, where like teenage girls had said that like this video, I don't even know what Slender Man is, but it's like this video game character
Yeah.
that's like kind of weird and lanky, and they were like, well, we had to stab our other friend because Slender Man was gonna get mad at us if we didn't. That was like a big thing in the news. um, and so we hear these really bad stories of things happening from media. And so I was thinking, okay, well, we know that parents are already thinking media effects can be negative. Researchers know that parental mediation is an effective intervention, but can we communicate that better to parents? Or what is the best way for us to communicate that to parents? And so, again, research is not always externally valid, it doesn't always match the real world. So I essentially took the extended parallel process model and created little flyers for parents, but they
Hmm.
were like they were pretty wordy. Um, and, it was like detailing different levels of susceptibility to media effects, different levels of severity of media effects, and then also manipulating the levels or the communication of self efficacy. Like, it's super easy to mediate content with your kid. Parental mediation has been shown to be effective by researchers for decades at this point. Um, and the sad part is it made no difference on parents' intentions to mediate content, um, which again, a lot of different reasons that could have happened. um,
Yeah.
the one that we kind of, or that I came to the conclusion was, and this was like a programming error on my part, I should have like forced the parents to stay on the page of the survey for like an average amount of time before advancing, because they could have just clicked on the page, not read the like flyer,
Right.
and advanced. I could have also made a video communicating it. I could have made like if I were to do it now, I'd probably do like an Instagram like carousel with different
Yeah.
slides that present the information. um, but that was a very, very long-winded answer to the
No, it was
question.
perfect. Yeah, no, incredibly informative. And I just find it like it's a really unique approach. So I think it's really interesting to hear about it and how you applied it to your research.
Yeah, yeah. And like that's the thing is, at this point in parental mediation research or just media effects research, like we're kind of beating a dead horse to some extent. Like, we know mediation works. That's not the issue anymore. Like, the issue is no longer what is parental mediation, what are the different types, how does it work, why does it work. The issue is getting parents to engage with their child about their media use. So I was hoping that we could find some intervention that worked. The one thing that was kind of interesting is we did see an indirect effect of response efficacy and with self efficacy. So essentially, if a parent was like thinking that the the threat was severe enough and the response efficacy was high and the self efficacy was high, they had like a slight uptick in implementation intentions, which again, also we weren't measuring behaviors because it was an online survey. Um,
Right.
so like it's showing that like there's something there. There is something to be said about if we can increase their response efficacy, self efficacy, and then that perceived threat level. So we don't want to scare parents too much, because if we scare parents too much, that's unethical. But like if we can just kind of communicate to them that like there is a threat there, you think of it as a triangle. Obviously it's an indirect effect. Um, but in layman's terms, there is something happening in terms of when we're scared and we think that it's effective, we're likely going to change our behavior. So now we just kind of have to dig around and see the best way to communicate the threat, but also not go overboard with communicating the threat.
Right. God, that's incredibly fascinating. So, you're currently studying how mothers are using the Barbie movie to talk about gender issues with their daughters. Can you tell us a bit more about that project?
Yeah, so it's actually with my best friend who I met in grad school. We had the same advisor, Dr. Ilana Peebles. She's an assistant professor of journalism and media studies at San Diego State University. Very long credentials, but so we both watched the Barbie movie, and at this point, I guess it was like 2 years ago that it came out. Research is very, very slow, as you know.
Yes,
But we were
absolutely.
watching it, yeah, and we were like, there's something here. And both of us had researched more with children before. But again, there's so much communication of like the negative things with media use. But we both, like, we watched the movie and we were just having a natural conversation about like our reactions to it. And we were like, wow, it actually seemed pretty realistic how they kind of were addressing gender issues in the real world. And it's so funny how they like mimicked that but flipped it on its head in the Barbie world with the Kens, and the Kens were the ones being discriminated against. Um, and so we kind of started thinking, well, there's like parental mediation doesn't stop, or it shouldn't stop once your kid enters elementary school, once your kid enters middle school. You can have these conversations. And if you like, if I'm just thinking about my family, a lot of the conversations, or like my mom will text me and be like, oh, did you watch this thing on Netflix? And I'm like, no, because Netflix doesn't let us share our passwords anymore. So I did not watch it. But, we're having conversations about media. And so we were really curious if people in the general public were having the types of conversations that we were having with each other about, seeing these kind of satirical takes, but also realistic takes on gender issues, and using the movie as a jumping off point to have meaningful conversations. And we're
Yeah.
still in preliminary data analysis. Yeah, I mean, like, it's just so fun. Like, it's so fun to think
Super.
like, yeah, it's not just us talking about this. Like, other people are talking about it. But so we started with parents and their daughters, um, or mothers and their daughters. We're trying to decide like if we want to look into fathers and their daughters, but now we're like, I don't know if it's too far out from the movie being whatever. But we
Right.
also collected data from San Diego State University because they have a much bigger population to get information from. And it's really actually fascinating because the college sample seems to be using the Barbie movie as more of a jumping off point to have conversations with their friends about gender issues or sexism that they're facing. Whereas a lot of like the mothers are, some of them are saying, like, yeah, I'm using this to discuss like a moment of discrimination that I faced, or like things like that. But a lot of the moms are just like, it was a fun movie. We wore pink to the theater. We liked the music. And like, in a way, that was really helpful for us to see because it also like reminded us that our academic bubble is
Yeah.
not necessarily reflective of the real world. And because we research media, we are probably more inclined to have these conversations. And of course, our college sample, which the majority of them were media studies students or journalism students, communication students, they're primed to think about these things. They're in these classes discussing media effects. So it might be more kind of second nature to them to just have these conversations. But it really, like, we were so fascinated looking and like still looking at the data and just kind of being like, what do we do with this? Like, what does this mean? And to one extent, I think it somewhat validates like my dissertation work and the work that is examining the like frequency of parental mediation, that like it's just not something that a lot of parents are thinking about. They're not thinking about, oh, let me use this movie that is fun. And we really were like, well, this because this movie is so fun, because this movie is like so popular, it's going to be a moment where like we're using this as conversations. And it's happening in some families, but it's not as frequent as we would hope.
It's fascinating because it can be difficult to think outside that academic bubble since we spend so much time
Yeah.
in it. It
Yeah.
it can when we come face to face, it's like, oh wait, these aren't the same conversations or thoughts being had
Yes.
outside of this bubble.
Yeah, and like I mean, we collected our data through Qualtrics. So Qualtrics
Hmm.
was, collecting our sample for us, and we requested that it be like, I mean, we can't say it's nationally representative, but it's a pretty diverse sample of like education level, employment status,
Yeah.
socioeconomic status. But it is like so fascinating because like she and I really like maybe we were a little too naive, but we're gonna like crack the code. We're gonna get like the most rich, open-ended answers. We're gonna figure out like how these conversations are actually happening. And there definitely were some parents or some mothers who said like, yeah, I explained to my daughter that when I was trying to get my first job, people looked down upon me or things like that. But it really kind of brought to light this kind of process that I'm thinking of. And one of the reasons that I think this podcast is like such a good idea because there's a communication issue in higher education and there's a communication issue in academia where when you're surrounded by everyone that has the same credentials or very similar credentials to you, when you're being surrounded by people who think about the same issues as you and also who think about issues in a very similar way to you,
Hmm.
usually. Like, yes, there's diversity, obviously, but like we're all kind of similar. And
Right.
it doesn't necessarily reflect the real world. And
Yeah.
I think it kind of brings to light like how are we helping people take the research that has been validated, has been replicated, and how do we kind of solve this communication problem? How do we help people understand that these silly studies that say that this thing is significant and what does significance mean and what are these variables, what's a hypothesis, how do we communicate that to people and have them use it in a way that's actually useful to them?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's really important and really well communicated on your end. And I love the study, regardless of the data that you
Yeah.
have gotten. I think it's
Yeah.
incredibly fascinating. And it's also
Yeah.
important to look at. I love, kind of pointing to pop culture and media when we're trying to take a look at these communicative events and kind of what's
Yeah.
going on interpersonally, but also
Yeah.
just in these different interactions. I think it's so fascinating and captivating because we consume this, obviously. We consume
Yeah.
this pop culture and this media. It's part and it's ingrained in us and it's part of our lives. And it can be incredibly telling of what influences us or what
Yeah.
changes our mindset or, makes us want to make change behaviors, kind of like what you were saying earlier and
Yeah.
whatnot. So I love
Yeah.
this. I
And like,
think it's incredibly fascinating.
yeah, I think it really just kind of opens a door to, and like I teach media literacy. It's a class I teach every semester. Um,
Yeah.
and like the things that like I think about, like I'm the first one to admit that I am watching The Real Housewives when I go home at night, that like I'm turning my brain off and I'm watching trashy, trashy reality TV. But like I also tell my students like although I can critique it and I know that it's not real and it's probably scripted on all of these things, it's still like there might be value in me watching it. Whatever. That's not the point. The point is that students really kind of struggle to think about the implications of what they're watching. And they're very quick to just be like, I'm watching media. So what? Like what's the point of it? And I'm also teaching representation in media, and we kind of dissect I mean, we could spend a whole year looking at different group representation in media, but it's really hard. Like the perspective taking is just hard for everyone. And if you're not a part of a group, seeing them, represented in seeing another group represented in the media, you're not critiquing it and you're not really thinking about if that's realistic or what the implication is on me and my life. And it really just comes back to the same thing. Like having these conversations, I tell my classes that like being in media literacy, taking representation in media, we're having the conversations that we would hope or we researchers want parents to be having. It doesn't have to be the most deep thing in the world, but being able to
Yeah.
look at magazines and see the same body type on the covers of every single magazine, and being able to point that out, that's the first step in mitigating some harmful effects, or at least like the first step in becoming aware of the issue.
Yeah. That's kind of a good segue, being that you just talked about like your own media usage, but how has your research changed the way you think about media in your own everyday life?
Yeah, I think that the one thing that has often kind of stuck with me is the value placement that a lot of people put on media use, or like a morality judgment of media use. I remember someone in my life, I'm not going to pinpoint who, just in case they hear this, but like someone in my life had said to me, "Oh, you watch reality TV? You're way too smart for that." And I was like, what do you mean? Like, what does that mean? But that's something that like in having conversations with other people, there is that like value judgment that we place on media use. And so it's really kind of helped me, my research has really helped me understand that like the media itself is not what is bad or what is good. Media,
Yeah.
its main purpose is to entertain and to make money. And that no matter what media is out there, that's what they're doing. And it's up to us to understand how we're using it. Like, I've become much more aware of, yeah, I am going home at the end of the day and watching The Real Housewives because I'm tired and like I thought a lot at work. And like, honestly, reading just sometimes feels like too much. And it's like I'm aware of the reasons why I'm using it, and I think because I'm aware of that, I can kind of feel less guilt, like rather than feeling like, oh, this isn't like academically sound or whatever. And that's something that I try to express to people is that there's a bunch of different ways to use media. There's a bunch of different ways to have conversations about media, and it doesn't make it like one better and one worse. It's just different. Like we were saying, like the media environments that we grew up in are different than media environments that our kids are growing up in, and it doesn't mean that one's better or one's worse. It's just different.
It's totally, yeah, absolutely. It's totally different. And if you could have one big breakthrough in this area of research, what would you hope it would be?
Yeah. I mean, kind of what we're just saying is I wish that I could figure out the way to communicate academic research to the general public in a way that's digestible and isn't intimidating and isn't just ignored. And I think it's so interesting, even like the students that are coming into my classrooms, they're just like we have to discuss the fact that like we all don't agree on what a fact is and we all don't agree on what establishes a fact or establishes knowledge. So I understand that like I mean, I guess the big breakthrough has already been done. Like we know that parental mediation works, but we kind of need to take it and apply it to parents a little bit more. And that's kind of what I was hoping would work with my dissertation. I think we all have big hopes for our dissertations, thinking that
Yeah,
they're going to be
we
the
do.
research that changes the world. Um, and very often they are not, and they're not supposed to be. They're supposed to be the starting point to your research agenda and your
Totally.
research
Yes.
career. But yeah, I just want to see, I want to figure out what kind of clicks for parents and the general public and not just, you know, the parents who are part of academia or the parents who even live in the university town. Like when we think about the participants that are often included in like in-person experiments, they're often from college towns, from university towns. Some of them are professors, and I just want to see it see research include more people and do a better job at helping people understand why the work that we do is so valuable, which I understand is a very, very broad answer to your question of the big breakthrough.
No, this is great.
But yeah, that's kind of how I see it is we know what works, but there's this barrier and just trying to figure out how we can break the barrier down.
No, that is perfect. Your work is incredibly fascinating. Your dissertation's fascinating. The work you're currently doing is fascinating and so relevant and important to the general landscape of media and parenting and young children and everything. So I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me for a bit today and talk about it. I think what you're going to find, hopefully, as you continue research, will continue to be incredibly relevant and interesting. But thank you so much,
Yeah.
Dr. Snyder.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate everything you're doing. I mean, my kind of soapbox that I ended on, you're actually doing the work to help people access this information and to make it more relevant to daily lives, spanning a bunch of different topics. And so I thank you for kind of giving all of us a platform and for helping us spread the good news of academic research.
That's incredibly kind. Thank you so much. We'll talk soon.
Of course.
Conversations about media aren't just about screen time or content filters. They're opportunities for connection, reflection, and growth. As Dr. Snyder reminds us, when parents take an active role in helping kids make sense of what they see, they're not just shaping media habits, they're shaping understanding, empathy, and communication that can last a lifetime. Thank you so much to Dr. Snyder for joining me and sharing her insights on how we can all be more intentional in the ways we talk about and through media. And as always, thank you for listening to Cultivate Talk, where we explore the many ways communication helps us grow, one conversation at a time.